The Texas legislature will vote on thousands of bills every session. Often, those debates can get overlooked even on critical pieces of legislation. That's why we've asked legislators to come to TPPF to talk about their bills to make sure you stay on top of the most important issues making their way through the Capitol. This is the layout. I'm David Dunmoyer, campaign director for Better Tech for Tomorrow, and today I'm joined by Senator Nathan Johnson. Senator Johnson, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on here.
Absolutely. Well, so today we're excited to talk about Senate Bill 2105, a bill that would provide more transparency for Texans and as it relates to the use of third-party data by data brokers and would require them to register with the Secretary of State. So I think, the most important piece about this bill and this discussion is that a lot of folks aren't aware of what data brokers are. So I'd love, Senator Johnson, if you can start by just setting the table. What are data brokers? And perhaps, in this bill, what was the issue that you saw that needed to be addressed?
Thank you. Data brokers are different than other entities that collect your information. When you engage in an online transaction, usually you're dealing with the vendor, but data brokers are entities with whom you have no direct relationship. They are simply collecting personally identifying information as well as patterns of web traffic that would give them a comprehensive picture of your online personal profile and your behavior and who you are, and they sell that information. That is inevitable in a world that is increasingly technological, but there need to be some constraints around it, and people need some reassurance and some recourse against the misuse of that information, and that's what this bill is seeking to address.
Absolutely. And as we've talked about too, it's the way this information can be used too. I mean, would you describe it as nefarious in certain instances? And that's one of the things that we focus on as well as the stories of, as I laid out or I discussed in testifying your bill. A U.S. district judge who was cyber stalked by somebody who bought her data, her information for pennies on the dollar and was able to find her where she lived and ultimately shot and killed her child. So this is a huge issue. And I appreciate you laying out, the difference between what we assume as a normal relationship between a data collecting company. We don't know who these are. So to that point, your bill addresses that. So how would your bill do that? What does it do at a high level?
Well, let's first acknowledge that there can be legitimate use of data, personal data, online data. Law enforcement needs it. It does facilitate commerce. There are entities that aren't necessarily bad forces out there, but again, this is very personal information, and it can and has been used to horrific results, as well as just kind of inconvenient, abusive results. We're talking about victims of domestic violence. We're talking about the instance that you testified for, which I greatly appreciated, by the way. Um, uh, Vengeances against certain individuals, or just predatory fraud against elderly people, people who are vulnerable and having to reestablish bank accounts. What we're doing with the bill is requiring all of these data brokers, again, these are third-party entities that you don't know that have your information. They now have to register with the Texas Secretary of State. They have to provide a notice on their website or on their mobile apps that they are third-party data brokers. What that allows individuals to do is, if, let's say, there's a media report of a security breach, data security breach, you can look up and say, is that an entity that does business in Texas? Could they have my data? Probably the most important thing that the bill does, however, is imposes a new regime of data security requirements on data brokers. It's very extensive. There are several pages really well thought out by the experts with whom we consulted in putting this bill together that make sure that the entities that collect your information are protecting your information so that you're not subject to the misuse of that information. And there are enforcement mechanisms. The Attorney General can bring an action against a data broker that does not abide by these security plans that they have to put together. So we think it was time to give people a little more reassurance and redress vis-a-vis the entities that are taking this information, and the bill, I think, does a pretty good job of that.
Absolutely agreed there. And you hit on this. I'll give you a chance to, if there's anything you want to add on, in thinking about these stories or thinking about elderly abuse or victim abuse, how do you see this bill making the lives of Texans better and in your vision of how this bill is operationalized?
The first is just a day-to-day feeling that I'm not subject to the wilds of predatory data collection,
Mhm.
right? People need to know there is a value just in knowing that there is a regime in place that's designed to protect me, day-to-day comfort level. The other part of it is there's a market incentive for data brokers and other entities that collect your information not to screw up,
Mhm.
but it's not that strong. We have added another layer of incentive, as well as just an absolute awareness for what are the kinds of things that we are going to do. Someone has thought through the process. How do we protect your data? So we're putting in place that something that will not just theoretically protect people's data, but what we think it actually will. So Texans will not wind up in the situation of having been victimized by abuse of their personal information. So hopefully no one will ever know how much this helped them,
Sure. That's
but we want it in place.
right. No, understood. Absolutely. And since we had a chance to have you lay out this bill and have a hearing on it, we heard some of the, I don't want to say pushback, it was a largely positive discussion. But some have argued that data brokers can provide important services. And you've hit on this already. But there are concerns that have been voiced that bills like this could be onerous or it could have an impact on the data collection benefits. So, how much you respond to this in the vein of Senate Bill 2105?
Fortunately, we do have in the legislative process a stakeholder process, and there are legitimate operators out there. There are legitimate uses of this data. There are conveniences that we all benefit from as a result of some of this data. And so through the process of talking with the data brokers, I think we've addressed the legitimate concerns um, without scaling down the bill to where it has no effect. I don't think the requirements it's imposing are onerous at all. They're thorough.
Mhm.
They're thorough, but if you're going to run a business in this space, if you're going to avail yourselves of my personal information and your personal information, yeah, you're going to have to follow some rules and you're going to have to implement some safeguards to make sure that you don't abuse my information. The feeling we have right now is that we've struck a really good balance. Those who might otherwise have opposed it, I think they recognize that for their industry to operate, they're going to have to follow some rules. And I think they're okay with where we are in this. And the consumer advocates have looked at this and feel greatly reassured that we're in the right place for right now.
Great. Well, and final question for you, Senator. You've hit on this throughout the discussion. You've talked to industry, you've talked to different stakeholder groups. What has been the reception on this bill in those communities, your constituency, and just more broadly in the Capitol? What's been the feedback so far?
It's it's actually great relief, really. I've seen everybody I've talked to is breathing a sigh of relief. They thought that the bill was going to be too onerous, or that the bill wasn't going to do enough.
Mhm.
And I really get the feeling, when we saw it in the hearing, when we had an array of advocates. Uh, from you representing the Texas Public Policy Foundation with concerns about privacy and concerns about harms that could come to people, to Texas Appleseed, which has long been associated with consumer advocacy almost exclusively. And the two of you were on exactly the same page. And we had four more witnesses, and everybody pretty much come up and said, this is a good approach to it. So it's a gratifying moment in the legislative process. This stuff's hard, and it's seldom you see such a consensus around an issue. So it's been one of the more satisfying ventures we've had here as legislators.
Great. Well, thank you, sir, for championing this important piece of legislation and for joining us during a busy session. Thanks so much for joining us for this discussion.
And I really appreciate the support of Texas Public Policy Foundation on this important issue. It is great to be able to work together on this.